Why did you write Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy? Is it a book you had long wanted to write, or have events and actions of leaders in recent years informed your decision?
Hi, Vicky. Thank you for having me. It's definitely something that I've been thinking about for a while, although I must say, in 30 years of writing about history, and don't know much about history, is actually celebrating its 30th anniversary. It's hard for me to believe that. But in writing that book and revising it recently, was thinking more and more about the fact that we had gone from an era of broken trust in America, where a lot of the faith in institutions had been challenged by many events in the past 20 or 30 years, to an era of broken democracy. And by that, I mean a lot of our basic institutions had started to weaken, and the fundamental feeling of a vibrant democracy in America, I thought, was being challenged. And I'm not talking about the past 4 years. And I should also point out there that Strongman is a book of history. It's not a book of contemporary politics. So there's no mention of any current American politicians in this book. I think the lessons of history are important. But this really is more a reflection that 30 years ago, we had the end of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall came down, the end of our apartheid in South Africa. There was this moment about 30 years ago when we felt that democracy was triumphant around the world, that we were entering a new era in which democracy, human rights, progress, basic fundamental ideas of privacy, freedom, liberty, all of those things that we prize as Americans was being shared worldwide in a rather extraordinary way. That feeling lasted, I think, about 10 years. And then with the beginning of the 2000s, you get the beginnings of authoritarians rising again, many of them in the former Soviet Union, starting with Vladimir Putin. But you see this in other places as well, in the Philippines, in South America. So I think that there was a trend away from democracy that was such a stark turnabout from what we had experienced in the early 90s with this growth of democracy, what one author famously called the end of history. So it wasn't that at all. And clearly, I believe it's accelerated in the United States in the past 10 years or so with the gerrymandering and the intense partisanship in the country and the Supreme Court decisions, particularly Citizens United and the end of the Voting Rights Act, and the clear suppression of votes around the country really made me feel we had entered a new phase in American history. And this is not my belief alone. You look at many surveys and studies from groups that look at democracy around the world. They say it is in retreat globally and has been for 15 years, including in the United States. So that's not
But why is that? I know that's a huge question, but why this 10 years? What happened? What was going through folks' minds?
I think two things I think it's a very complicated question, and we could probably spend an hour talking about that. But I think two things in particular hastened this in the last 15 years or so. One is the immigration problem, the global immigration issue, which became a crisis a few years ago. It seems to have receded from the popular imagination and attention, although we think about an immigration problem in the United States. That feeling of a crisis when we were seeing these boats filled with people, desperate people coming from Africa into Europe, and seeing a boy wash up on the beach, a dead child, that sense of crisis, I think, elevated this, certainly in Europe, and shifted many European countries, progressive, liberal-minded European countries, towards more populist, nationalist leadership. That's clearly been part of the case. I think you also have to look at the tremendous impact of the Great Recession, 2000, 2007, 2008. Certainly, we felt it here in the United States. It was a global catastrophe. And so you have the combination of the immigration issue with the tremendous pressure put upon countries by the breakdown that came about in the Great Recession. And that led to a great movement towards nationalism and populism, which are sort of the twin features that almost every strongman I write about starts with. Our nation has been brought low because of foreign influences. We're in an economic crisis. We have to make our nation great again. And our people are being downtrodden because of these outside groups, whether it's, the bankers or the immigrants. So this is a core of how the strongman comes to power. And I think that that's one of the reasons those two things are central to the spread of authoritarianism in the past 20 years.
And that includes a Supreme Court that's making decisions that are perhaps more in line with that way of thinking. And it might include elections, the rise of, even in democratic places, leaders that tend to favor a more autocratic type of rule.
Well, I think, again, without being, this book is not a partisan book about a partisan American politics. It certainly is warning about the threats to democracy. I love the Washington Post. I read it all the time. I subscribe to it online. But as its famous motto says, democracy dies in darkness, it does not. History says democracy often dies in broad daylight while thousands of people are cheering. Certainly the case with Mussolini and Hitler. And by the way, we're speaking on the anniversary of the day that Mussolini became the prime minister of Italy, put into a position of power in a constitutional democracy.
Right.
It was a constitutional monarchy. He did not come to power at the head of a column of tanks or threaten Rome with a revolution. He made the threat of that, the famous March on Rome, in which maybe 10,000 men carrying golf clubs and sticks and a few old rifles were going to march on Italy. But they would have easily been turned away by the government if the government had the nerve to do that. They lacked that nerve. The king of Italy invited Mussolini in, and he took power and quickly turned a constitutional democracy, one that was clearly struggling, into a one-party state under his fascist party. So that's how quickly it happens. 10 years later, approximately, Hitler does exactly the same thing in Germany. He's put into a position of power in a constitutional democracy, named the chancellor, equivalent to a prime minister, and within a very short space of time, Germany also erases all of the constitutional protections it had. Progressive democratic ideas. Women voted in Germany long before they voted in the United States or Great Britain. That was erased and washed away overnight practically. So that's how quickly it happens. And that's why this book was so important to me at this moment in American history. And part of that is clearly the fact that Americans have never been very good about voting. In a good year, we get 60%, around 60% in a presidential election, typically more like 50%. And in the off years, the midterms, we get 40%. So we've never been a nation of voters. We don't take it seriously. I think we take it for granted. And that's not only sad, it's dangerous. And I do believe it's a reflection of the fact that we have not taught social studies and history with the importance they deserve. And that's a really serious problem, perhaps also for another hour.
I know a lot of social studies teachers who would agree with that sentiment. So you mentioned Mussolini and Hitler. Why don't you talk about the five strong men you write about in Strongman, the Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy? And what are the few traits they have in common? Maybe how they are different from one another?
Let me start with the five and who they are and why I chose them. Mussolini and Hitler, I've already mentioned. They are the first of two of the five. Then Joseph Stalin, who became the master of the Soviet Union. followed by Chairman Mao Zedong of China, and then Saddam Hussein of Iraq. I think that the first four of those five are fairly obvious and easy choices. They were the four men who transformed history and the world map and the course of history in the 20th century without any question. So I think that they were easy choices. There are also, if you just talk about the numbers, and I don't like to talk about numbers, but in fact, these men were responsible for tens of millions of deaths, individually and collectively. Stalin killed millions of people before World War II even started in what is known as the Ukrainian Holocaust. He literally starved them to death by taking the wheat from the Ukraine for the Soviet Union. Chairman Mao, the numbers are astonishing. 40 to 50 million people dead during his regime, some of them again by mass starvation in his plans to industrialize and make China a modern industrial power. That's exactly what Stalin had done. They did that at tremendous cost in human lives. So I think those four were easy. The inclusion of Saddam, I had a long list of possible other strongmen, ruthless dictators who were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. But I chose Saddam Hussein because, first of all, because his story is so closely connected with US history in the past 30 years. He is the only one of these 20th century strongmen, in a sense, that we went to war with twice. The United States went to war with twice. So I thought that that puts him in a somewhat unique position. He also embodies all of the traits of the strongman, which we'll talk about next. And very, very specifically, he was a student of Stalin. Stalin was his model. He is nicknamed, and the chapter on Saddam is called the Stalin on the Tigris River, of course, in Iraq. He modeled his regime on Stalin. He used his techniques. He had his secret police train with the East German secret police, who were trained by Stalin's secret police. So there's a real connection, I think, between one strong man and this one. So that's the rationale for including these five men. They certainly have many differences in their countries, in their histories, in what they did, but they have enormous similarities. And I'll start with the four things that I think help bring these men to power. First, I already discussed it: extreme nationalism and populism. Certainly that's true of Mussolini and Hitler and Saddam in some respect. And that nationalism and populism is often reflected by, this was a great nation, we must restore it to its former glories, the glories that existed in the past. For Mussolini, that is the glory of ancient Rome, that Rome was the greatest civilization in history at one point, and now Italy is downtrodden and poor and broken, and it's because of, and you can go down the reasons that Mussolini said that, again, pointing to outside enemies, which is the next thing they have in common: finding some common enemy to scapegoat for the problems of their country. And in Mussolini's case, he pointed to the European powers that had betrayed Italy after World War I, he thought, and many Italians thought, as well as the tremendous fear of socialism and communism that was rising because of the revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution and the establishment of Soviet Union. So they had the downtrodden state that should be made great again, an outside enemy, and then the idea that there's tremendous corruption in the system, and that corruption can only be cleaned up by one man who's going to bring law and order. These are the four, I think, central ideas. There are certainly others, and there are slight variations with these men, but those are the things that they use to acquire their power. And then they quickly move from there to a list of things they do to cement their power. And that's a much longer list, but it begins usually with eliminating the free press, eliminating opposition, demanding loyalty, changing the courts to be more favorable, putting loyalists into positions in the courts, demanding loyalty from intellectuals and teachers from the educational system. Mussolini demanded that every teacher, every professor in Italy sign a loyalty oath. 1,200 university professors approximately sign that loyalty oath. 12 do not. That's a rather extraordinary idea to me. The elimination of any political opposition, legally or illegally, violently in some cases. Mussolini's fascists removed between 2,000 and 3,000 people were killed, opposition figures. Most famously, a senator gets up in the Italian legislature after an election, which the fascists dominate by 90%, and he talks about how corrupt and fraudulent this election is. The next day he disappears. His body is found a few weeks later. So through means legal and illegal, and often violent and often ruthless, all opposition is removed. Certainly Stalin with his purges did the same thing. Hitler, when he comes into power, there are a number of purges of anyone who is not completely loyal to him. So this is the way these men operate. This is the way they come into power, and then this is the way they cement their power. And eventually they erase any vestige of democracy or constitutional protections and turn a constitutional democracy, in the case of Italy and Germany, into a one-party state. Now, Soviet Union, Russia, before it became the Soviet Union, and China were not long-standing democratic republics, but they were moving in that direction. The Chinese emperor had stepped down, abdicated, and he was replaced for a very, very brief period by a Chinese republic. It did not really have time to take root, and there was tremendous infighting going on in China, this massive country. But it was at this moment in the early 20th century when democracy was really expanding around the globe, and monarchies, the Tsar in Russia, violently were being replaced in some cases. In Germany, the Kaiser had abdicated after World War I. So this was a moment when democracy, at least in theory, was expanding into some of these places. So even though it was not established well in Russia and China, it was a moment at which it could have gone that way, but instead these two men, Stalin in Russia, the Soviet Union, and then Mao in China, crush any hopes that there would be a progressive democratic republic.
Important to know that, because you sort of just think all these folks, all these people fell in line, and yet you don't hear about the 2,000 or 3,000 that you said of Mussolini, sort of high up, powerful, very well respected people who died so early on. Just like that, it seems like. And to give them a little more credit, the people, a little more credit for standing up for what is right.
All of these men faced opposition, and the opposition was often removed, and often removed violently. And in most of these cases, of course, their regimes only came to an end. Was certainly Mussolini, Hitler, and Saddam Hussein. Their regimes only come to an end with war and a violent upheaval. Stalin's Soviet Union lasted until the 1990s, of course, when Soviet communism fell apart under the weight of its own corruption. And of course, Mao's China is a very different story. It's moved towards this, and remarkably towards this blending of capitalism and old line Maoist communism, where he is still revered as the great leader. But certainly no one should be under the illusion that the arrival of capitalism and the explosion of Chinese economy in the past 20, 30 years has been anything other than a completely state-directed single party movement. And people seem to be, there's been unrest, of course, in Hong Kong and other places in China, but people are, for the most part, supportive of a regime that has brought the standard of living in China up incredibly in a rather short period of time. And that's always part of the support for a strongman, for a one-party state. If people feel like this strongman is making their lives better, they are happily going to go along with it and cheer. When you see the crowds cheering Mussolini, crying Il Duce, the leader in Rome, or when you see the tens of thousands of faces at a Hitler rally, glorious, it's because they had done what seemed like and making lives better for their people, at least at first. And so that's why there is tremendous popular support. These men don't come into power because they have some new idea that they're introducing to people. Very often they're just playing off what the popular mood is. Certainly Hitler's anti-Semitism was not his idea. It was an ancient, old, rooted idea in Germany and much of the rest of Europe. He was able to voice it and vocalize it at a time when Germany was in such tremendously difficult straits, that he was, preaching to the choir, as we might say. And so that's important to realize also. These men don't come to power because they have necessarily some new ideology, but they're speaking to people's needs and desires on a very, very internal basis. And that's a powerful source of their popularity and appeal. That for me was the reason for writing this book. In essence, the notion that American democracy is something that's permanent, eternal, and strong is a very much a mistaken notion, especially when we look at the situation in the country right now. So this book is, in a way, a warning call that history is a lesson that can teach us important lessons. First of all, how quickly democracy can vanish, but also what we need to do to protect it. And I hope people will read this book and not just in the moment think about that, but I think this is a lesson that will be true for a very long time, because I believe that American democracy will survive. It's a question of how well it will survive and how healthy it will be going forward. And that's a really important question for every generation.
You're reading it and you think how, you go back to that question. How could we have let this happen? How could we, I'm a good person. I would have stood up. Why do we fall for these men? Why do we fall for these strong men time and time again? I understand the economic issue, and that is terrible. It's horrifying not knowing where you're going to pay the rent and put food on the table. It takes a village. And in this case, it's taken a lot of villages to put these men in power. What goes on in the human psyche? You must think about this when you write your books, about your own self.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a question that I think we all wonder about, and how could such a thing happen? And I think the answers from history are fairly obvious, not simple, but obvious. Economic insecurity is certainly at the beginning of it. Economic insecurity, self-preservation, family preservation, those are powerful impulses. We all want to not only survive, we want to do well. We want to get our fair share. We want to, if we're working hard, get rewarded for it. Now, different people throughout history have come up with different plans for how to do that for people, but that's still at the essence of it. And you go back, I cite Plato in this book because he wrote about the threats to democracy and the fact that democracy was one of several forms of government and not necessarily the best. And he also believed that democracy would eventually fall to a tyrant. But he also writes about 2,500 years ago, at least, the extraordinary disparity in wealth, and that he writes about the fact that there are always going to be these great differences in wealth, what we would today call economic inequality. He was writing about it in ancient Greece, and he always thought that that was the source of social instability. So that hasn't changed in 2,500 years, and it's very true in America today, and it was certainly true in Italy 100 years ago, and Germany a little after that, and certainly would be true for the peasants of Russia and the millions of peasants of China, who eventually become the armies that cling to these ideas that that Stalin and Mao put forth. So that's at the essence of it. That goes along with fear. So our economic insecurities and fears, our desires for things, push us to be afraid of things, to be afraid. And so if that fear is then hijacked and magnified and amplified and directed towards one particular group, whether it is the Jews for Hitler, the communists and the socialists for Mussolini, for Stalin and Mao, the industrialists, the capitalists who are keeping us under their boot heels. Finding that fear that people will respond to is very important. Then once in power, of course, that fear is turned in a different way. You now fear that if I am not loyal to this person, if I am not, if I do not go along, I will disappear in the night. So fear becomes a different kind of fear once they are in power. And that, again, is part of the strongman's playbook. They also, one of the things I talk about, and it's a little bit different, is that they also begin to cultivate a generation of children very, very rigidly to believe in them as the supreme leader and that the nation is the leader. This is the cult of personality that I talk about in the book. So the means to coming to power and the techniques are always related, but I think it is fundamentally that sense that human beings have of wanting a degree of personal security, family security, and the fear of losing that, and then placing blame on someone else for threatening that sense of security or not having things. So this is a very, very ancient idea that has played out time and time and time again. And I certainly believe it played out in this country in 2016. I think that was, the essence of Donald Trump's approach to winning the presidency, the playing on the economic fears, the sense of people feeling that they had something taken away from them, and in his case, clearly blaming that on immigrants to some degree, and the threat coming from Muslims specifically. And I mean, this is not partisan to say this. This is his basically the things he ran on when he came down that escalator. So every generation has produced this. What is unique, and I mentioned this briefly in that passage I read, is that for more than 200 years, we have not fallen prey to a strongman in this country. In our greatest moment of crisis, the American Civil War, the nation produced Abraham Lincoln. In our next greatest crisis, the Great Depression, and then the run up to World War II, the nation was graced with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, both men made mistakes. They were human, they were flawed, they were imperfect. You can point to many things they did wrong, but for the most part, these were men who expanded freedom, expanded democracy, expanded rights. Franklin D. Roosevelt talks about the four freedoms. It is such a stark contrast. In the United States in the 1930s, he's talking about the four freedoms, while Mussolini and Hitler are coming to power and accruing their power and cementing their power ruthlessly in Italy and Germany. So that's a striking and stark contrast about the United States of America from many other democracies around the world to this date. And that's, is certainly one of the reasons I wrote this book, that we cannot take it for granted that this thing is forever.
Well, you mentioned the Civil War, and a few years ago, you told me that you couldn't envision writing a book that does not include in some way the issue of racism. In America, it's at the heart of much of the country and how we react to things.
Absolutely. And, when we talk about racism in the United States, I think most people instantly think of racial equality. But racism has many forms, of course. But all of these men exhibited a large degree of racism. And that includes anti-Semitism as part of racism. But certainly, for instance, you look at Mussolini and his rage to have a great Italian empire again, modeled on the glory of ancient Rome. What is the first thing he does? Well, he believes that Italy deserves an empire like the other European countries. It's been denied that in the wake of World War I. So he goes and sets about attacking poor, weak, rather defenseless countries in Africa to begin Italy's expansion. And there's certainly a racist quality to that effort, that he goes to war with these African nations. And certainly there was an element of racism in the reaction of the world, the rest of the world, that was, well, Mussolini's only going after Africa. So, they didn't really, even though he was breaking the Geneva Conventions by using gas and chemical weapons against these people, it was racism that sort of gave him a pass on that. It's not really until he gets involved in the war in Spain, the fascists versus the Republicans in Spain, that the world sort of sits up and takes notice and say, well, maybe Mussolini's not such a good deal after all. Hitler's racism is clear. And as I do point out in this book, Hitler modeled some of his laws, and some of his most admiring words came for the way America had dealt with minority populations, and was dealing with people who he thought were subhuman. So Germany models itself in some respects on America's own laws, the Jim Crow laws that kept American blacks as second-class citizens, the eugenics laws that were spreading in the 1920s in the United States, the fact that Henry Ford published, before Hitler brings the protocols of the Elders of Zion to prominence in Germany, it was published in the United States by Henry Ford in his own newspaper, which was not just some local newspaper. Henry Ford's newspaper was given out in every Ford dealership in the country. So the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this propaganda that was produced in Tsarist Russia, that is known to be historic fake and historic propaganda and historic calumny on the Jews, is promoted first in the United States before it gets the wide promotion in Germany. So that's part of the story as well. And that's why you're right. I have said that we can't talk about any aspect of history, certainly United States history, without talking about that deep roots of racism. And racism, of course, has different characteristics. And I think that we misled ourselves to some degree in 2008 with the extraordinary election of Barack Obama as the first biracial African-American Black president, whichever term you prefer, that people thought, well, we were in a new biracial moment in American history. And I think that time has proved that seriously wrong. And we are certainly in a moment of great reckoning right now in this country on questions of race. still to be resolved.
When you mention things like Mussolini gassing Ethiopian people, African people during World War II, when you mention Hitler Youth, and actually that there were a variety of youth movements that these dictators supported, I think I would have really liked to have known that as a student of history in middle school and in high school. And I know it sounds scary and maybe teachers want to avoid it, they're afraid of, but are we, with respect to teachers, and you and I have a ton of respect for teachers, are we teaching it wrong? Should we be discussing more of the stories that you write about in your book, that look, Hitler wanted to be an artist, Mao was a librarian's assistant, and somehow these men turned into monsters? Is there something that we could be doing as teachers, if we're going to not have strong men or hope to not have strong men, that's a little more honest with students, with young people?
Look, I have to say, yes, absolutely, we have to. And let me back up a little bit into my own career in writing about history and how I've done this. But I'll preface that by saying, absolutely, teachers are heroic. They're more heroic now than they've ever been before. And I honor and respect what they are doing so deeply that I just wish we could, have the same honor and respect that we have for teachers that we have for, athletes, obviously. That's just been our sense of priorities for a long time. We talk about how important education is in this country, but we've done precious little to actually support it over many, many years. I don't know how many presidents I've known that campaigned as the education president. I'm going to be the education president. So again, I think we could have another whole hour, 2 or 3, about the issues of education in this country and what teachers face. But I started out 30 years ago writing books for adults who had gone through school, had been educated or miseducated, and that's who I was writing for. People who had either learned history wrong, never learned it at all, or forgotten everything they may have learned. And I wanted to make history, because so many people said to me 30 years ago when I wrote Don't Know Much About History, it is so boring, it is so dull, it's just dates and battles and speeches. And I have always believed from childhood that history is anything but boring. To me, it was always human, alive, interesting, fascinating, and most of all, significant. And when we tell stories about real people doing real things, that's what makes history come to life. In the past 10 years or so, and I go back to around 2010, I started to go into class. Even though I talked to students in the past, I had never really done too much one-to-one with students. But I started to, because of the advent of Skype and virtual visits, go into classrooms. And I was so incredibly struck by the intelligence, interest, energy, excitement, enthusiasm of young people to hear real history. They were interested. And this was such a striking contrast to the media presentation of kids as really disconnected and interested in social media and games and their phones, even 10 years ago, that I thought I need to really talk directly to these kids, because first of all, I was learning a lot from them. And second of all, it gave me a new burst of energy about what I am doing as a writer, and I think as an educator. And so that's why I wrote In the Shadow of Liberty first, which is the first nonfiction book I wrote aimed at middle grade young adult readers. But I also have to stop and say there that all of my young adult books are not written very differently than I would write for adults. I think that, many adults have read my so-called young adult books, not even knowing that they were aimed at younger readers.
Yeah, I was one of those. I think you're the one who told me.
To be honest, the essential difference The essential difference between some of my books for adults and my books for young adults is, number one, they're shorter. There's no question about that, they are a little shorter. They are more heavily illustrated, and they tend to be in bigger print. And you know what? A lot of adults like that. They like pictures, they like bigger print, and they like shorter, especially right now when we're struggling to deal with the news. So I think that this approach to history, while it's aimed at and geared towards students, actually appeals to a great many adults, and the lessons are just as important for them as they are for children. Now, to your question about what we tell the children, this idea that kids are somehow need to be protected from the reality of history is a really dangerous idea. And that's where we get into this notion that existed for 200 years, that we have to tell history as this proud patriotic narrative in which these perfect men did no wrong. And that's certainly the history that I grew up with. You did not learn when I was a child that Washington and Jefferson were slaveholders. It is central to everything they did as presidents, politicians, and leaders. And to ignore that is to just whitewash history. I know that there's been a great change in many respects in the past 20 or 30
Yes,
years.
for sure.
I think that there's still a reflection of that, but there's no question, we do a terrible job when it comes to especially teaching slavery.
Yeah.
And I've written about this for a long time. In the Shadow of Liberty really comes out of 30 years going back to, don't know much about history, of asking, how do these men who write these words, all men are created equal, who go to war, who take enormous risks to fight for that ideal, how do they go back to these plantations utterly dependent upon enslaved labor? A system that of such barbarous cruelty, murderous cruelty, that involved rape and torture and maiming and disfigurement and the complete negation of any rights or liberties. How do these men do that? It is the essential great contradiction in American history, that a nation conceived in liberty is born in chains. So I wrote about that for a long time from the perspective of those men. And in the Shadow of Liberty, I wanted to flip the script and talk about it in terms of the people who were enslaved by these so-called great men. And I don't think that there's any question that telling students the truth is any way harmful or dangerous or makes them hate America,
Right.
as has been said. So I think I really have to push back hard on that idea that kids aren't able to handle this stuff, that it's too intense for them. The news is intense. What we're living through is intense. What they're living through right now is intense. They can certainly handle the truth about history. And so that's why I've tried to put it in a way that's accessible and readable and conversational even, but without sugarcoating it or whitewashing it, because the truth is ultimately what sets us free. And as John Adams said in one of the quotes, that it's been kind of my motto, not democracy dies in darkness, but facts are stubborn things. And so we as educators have to stick to facts. And I know I had this conversation just this past week with a group of teachers in Wisconsin, speaking to them about Strongman and how they can talk about these things in classrooms that reflect the same kind of partisan divide. And I understand that difficulty. I understand the pushback that they might get from parents, the pushback that they certainly get from administrators who don't want to rock the boat. But our job essentially is to be faithful to the facts. And we can teach facts in a way that isn't just a long list of dates and battles and speeches. We can humanize it. And I think we must humanize it. A lot of kids are learning now at a very young age when it comes to the issue of bullying, I believe that this idea comes out of the anti-bullying program, that there are three responses to bullying. You can be a collaborator, go along with it. You can be a bystander, watch and sort of not do anything. As long as they're not bullying me, I'm cool with it. Or you can be an upstander who goes up and says, stop bullying that kid. I'm going to do something about it. I think the same ideas apply to Strongman.
Okay.
That when we look at the response of the people in these countries, it pretty much falls into those three categories as well. Collaborators. These histories show I write about these men as individuals, but they could not do what they did without the participation of millions of willing accomplices. That means generals, businessmen, industrialists in some cases, masses of people who believed in these approaches. So those are the willing collaborators who are one group. And it's a very large and powerful group for these strongmen. There are also the bystanders. And the bystanders are perhaps most famously voiced by the man who wrote about, when they came for the communists, I said nothing because I was not when they came for the Jews, I said nothing because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. I include that rather famous statement in the last chapter of the book. That man was for a while a bystander. He was willing to go along with the Nazi program until he couldn't go along any longer. And then, of course, he was put into a Gestapo prison. And then finally, there are the upstanders. And the upstanders are the people who stand up and speak out. And unfortunately, the history of most upstanders in these five stories is not very happy one. Sophie Scholl, for instance, I tell the story of the White Rose, this student opposition to the Nazis, and all of these young people, some of them still teenagers, some of them college age, are eventually executed under the Nazis. We know what opposition meant to Stalin, Mao, and certainly Saddam Hussein. It meant torture, imprisonment, death very often. There was a whole system of concentration camps set up under Stalin, the Gulag Archipelago, as it's known, which was meant for dissidents and opponents. And the stories of the purge of Stalin's opponents, either individually or collectively, are horrific to learn and understand. So being a bystander is not, being an upstander from the perspective of history is not always the safe course, but it's an important course. And I think one lesson of American history is that the upstanders have been the people who got out and marched and spoke out and protested, even if they did not have a vote. The great changes in our history have come from people who had no vote, but they had a voice. Suffrage, abolition, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement to a degree, were all started and continued by people who often had no vote, but they had a voice. And it's in that collective voice of standing up together that great progress has been made in this country, slowly and painfully, but nonetheless, progress has been made. So I think it always will come down to that choice. Am I going to be a collaborator, a bystander, or an upstander? And I'm kind of, in I'd like to think in the upstander portion. My heroes include two of the men who were killed when I was a teenager. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy died within months of each other in 1968. I was 14 years old. That was a turning point for the country, a turning point year for me as a as a young person in this country, watching the Vietnam War, watching the change in how people thought about the war, was profoundly affected me. So a few years later, I couldn't vote yet, but we walked out of school. That was the moratorium in the anti-war moratorium during the Vietnam era. So even though I didn't have a vote, I had a voice, and you know, we knew that it didn't change anything immediately, but it certainly did change the country in the long run. So I think that that's the choice I think is important to present to students, and the history that's important to present to students. And I don't think that you have to be leery or nervous or afraid or worried that they can't handle the truth. They can. And it's a lot better to teach them real stories, even if they are scary stories, because sometimes it's good to be afraid. It's good to be afraid in a way that motivates you to do the right thing.
I don't know if the news, well, the press covered the moratorium during the Vietnam. I don't know if your local paper covered you guys walking out, but I know you write a lot about the news media in your book, how it played a key role in the rise of strongmen. And I'm wondering, why is this the case? I thought journalists were supposed to act as, watchdogs and as check on those in power. So what are a couple of aspects of news coverage today that might mimic the mistakes of the past, and when those men came into power? And I guess what could you tell me? What could you tell my colleagues about the importance of getting it right?
Well, the importance of journalism and getting it right is that one aspect of the strongman, and it's in the book in terms of the strongman's playbook, is the elimination of a free press. All of these men quickly moved to suppress opposition, whether it's opposition politicians or a press that they might view as the opposition. So one of Mussolini's first tricks is to really make the press a fascist press, and to do that often involved violence, burning down newspapers that were of the opposition and getting rid. And he was a newspaper man himself. He understood the power of the media, the power of the press. He understood that also in terms of popular media, because Italy didn't have as powerful a newspaper culture, because literacy was an issue in Italy in the early 20th century, and the radio wasn't a big deal, but movies were very, very popular. So one of the first things that the fascists do is require every movie theater to show a newsreel, a so-called newsreel, that is produced by the fascist party before any movie starts. That's controlling the propaganda, that's controlling the media, that's controlling information. This is central to every one of these men. Stalin, his first job is actually involved working for Pravda, so-called truth, the organ of the Soviet Communist Party. So he understood the role of propaganda as well. Hitler certainly understood it, and also moved quickly after he was installed as chancellor to shut down any presses so that there was only a Nazi press. So the role of an independent, vocal press that is protected in the United States by the First Amendment is crucial in a society that's going to be healthy and not go the way of the strongman. That is a real issue in our time, as we know, because the media has become such a focus of what we teach in school about media literacy. Who do we believe? And quite honestly, again, not to sound a partisan note here, but no president in my lifetime has attacked the press the way this president has attacked the press and called it outright the enemy of the people. There was certainly during Nixon's time, there were attacks on the media, there were attacks on the press. He has especially sent his vice president at the time, Spiro Agnew, out to talk about, it was a famous phrase at the time, the nattering nabobs of negativism. That's a long way from enemy of the people. But they were clearly trying to make the case that the press was the enemy in Nixon's time. But that has been amplified and magnified greatly in our own time, especially with the advent of social media. So I think there's no question that the vigorous free press, not an opposition press, but a free press, is so important to the preservation of democracy. And go back and see what Thomas Jefferson said about it, because he understood that as well. But even though in those days they set up their own presses, Jefferson and his party had their own favorite newspapers, just as the Federalists set up their own newspapers. So there's nothing new about the idea of a partisan bias in the news. I think that we have to be really on guard about what we are accepting as facts these days. And it's one of the real symbols of a healthy democracy in which a strong man has not been able to eliminate the voices of opposition and control the flow of free information.